So, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to welcome you. It's actually my last lecture here in Yogyakarta, and I'm happy to speak about decadence, order, and the intellect. It's about Volker Feyerabend's philosophy of science. And I would like to introduce to you a new notion, actually, which has not been considered in the discussion before. It's the notion of decadence. And perhaps this notion can serve as a reminder of how one could understand several different aspects in philosophy of science. So the idea is that Paul Feyerabend, as no one else so to speak, is well known, but mostly in a kind of polemic way. He's understood to be the provocative one, and as Anthony Perowich put it, you can see it in the reference on the slide. As Perowich put it, the work of Volker Feyerabend has been criticized more often than it has been understood. And this is, so to speak, what we're starting from, and this can serve as a motto when dealing with Feyerabend's work. It is a reflex of most to criticize something which destroys the old order of the rational, of seemingly stable scientific standards. So there is actually kind of notorious view on Feyerabend, notorious for the anything goes slogan, of course. Yet there is a new approach possible, and the new approach is an approach which tries to apply, so to speak, the notion of decadence. I will explain this to you further. So the name of Feyerabend is notorious, well known for the anything goes slogan, of course, confronting the order of rational discourse as embodied by his former teacher Karl Popper. Apart from this rather polemical stereotypes, Feyerabend still has something to offer theoretically, which goes far beyond the cliches describing him. Yeah? These cliches are not all, of course. One vehicle for pointing out a possible new approach to the work of Paul Feyerabend is the notion of decadence. And at first glance, decadence as a category, as a scientific category, is a bit irritating because it means decay, it means the evening of a development, so to speak, the evening of an approach, even the scientific one, an ending of something. This is the negative way to see the decadence notion. But decadence can also be described as what happens when things go wrong. This is a different suggestion, when an intention cannot be fulfilled. In this case, the concept of rationality itself came to an end, so to speak, or saying it less apodictically, the concept of rationality is questioned heavily, and this is of course what Feyerabend did, especially the late Feyerabend, after his former work where he was still in the course of the argument of his former teacher Popper. So there are two possible understandings of decadence. This can be said so far. And the main aspect is that decadence is not only negative. Decadence is not only a negative notion. And, well, I took the Oxford Advanced Dictionary, the Advanced Learner's Dictionary, and there is a definition of the common understanding of the word, of the category of decadence. And it means, I quote, decadence is described in the Oxford Advanced Learner's Dictionary as falling to a lower level in morals, art, literature, etc., especially after a period of high level. So this is the common understanding as we find it in the dictionary, of course. But, and this is B, the new advanced view seeing decadence as a possibility to change outworn theoretical concepts is what I would like to suggest here. So it's about the positivity of decadence, B, and it has to be implemented in the scientific discourse. This is the main hypothesis of my talk today. So science is not only constituted by common standards and common structures, and this is what this longer quotation on the slide is about. It's quoted from Paul Feyerabend's book Against Method from the third edition, 1993. You can find it, you have the reference here. So I quote, you can read it on the slide. The thesis is the events, procedures, and results that constitute the sciences have no common structure. There are no elements that occur in every scientific investigation, but are missing elsewhere. Concrete developments, such as the overthrow of steady-state cosmologies and the discovery of the structure of DNA, have distinct features and we can often explain why and how these features led to success. But not every discovery can be accounted for in the same manner, and procedures that paid off in the past may create havoc when imposed in the future. So the main aspect of this longer quotation is that there are no common structures of science, and instead of the discovering of the DNA of some cosmologies and so on, not every discovery can be accounted for in the same manner. There are important differences, and this is of course the important point. So what this quotation said in a rather indirect way is that completeness in scientific discourse is actually often an idol which is not recognized as such. Discoveries are not self-explanatory. They need a context in which they exist and in which the newly discovered element is part of an established pattern giving the impression of completeness. But it's important to see this, really how this is formulated. It's only the impression of completeness, it's not completeness itself, of course. Completeness is a telos, a goal, it's a goal-orientated discourse which can be discussed. Our societies, our societal entities are used to privilege the complete, and most often, in most cases, they are not aware of that. The privileging the complete is really a constituting element in the normal science, as Thomas Kuhn might put it. So, completeness is also an idol, and with this notion of the idol, I'm referring to Francis Bacon, the philosopher, and he said this in his Novum Organon 1620 in his famous doctrine of the idols. Completeness is also an idol, one of the idolaphori, that's how he calls it, idols of the marketplace. So the idea is, if you have these idols of the marketplace, you have no longer the famous Greek agora, where in a seemingly democratic way everybody was interacting with each other on a just level, where there was so kind of democratic discourse on this agora and everybody could really be integrated in the discourse. This of course was not the case, so the idea of agora as an outstanding place of communication of everybody with everybody is really not valid today if we consider it from the point of view of the philosophy of science. This idea of the idols of the marketplace can serve as a reminder that we sometimes use notions in the scientific discourse which are actually having the quality of being idols. This is not seen. So thinking is often located in the realm of idols in the sense of Francis Bacon without noticing it. That's the important point. There is something almost unconscious about it. Francis Bacon is relevant here, not only being a philosopher wanting to subject nature under the will of human beings, but being a linguistic criticist avant la lettre. And some people thought this in research, but actually it's too seldomly addressed. So Bacon has something which is very interesting with his concern to his doctrine of the idols, which makes him a linguistic criticist avant la lettre, and therefore he's seeing this idolaphori really preventing, not promoting kind of a rational discourse. So what is important with respect to the philosophy of science is that the great demarcation lines of thinking are often set in the realm of idols, and we mostly don't know it. That the demarcation lines of the thinking of the so-called great thinkers or big thinkers are mostly set in the realm of idols, and we don't notice it. So this idol-like quality deceiving us can come into play when the craving for completeness in the scientific field stays unquestioned. And really it happened by design that I was using the word craving, which is actually has an emotional quality about it. It's a craving for completeness. It's not only the intention of completeness or the idea of completeness. It's something which really has a psychological impact even, and which is not noticed in most cases by the participants of the scientific discourse. So completeness is really meant to be one big thing and one important criterion in scientific discourse, which means to take the opponent in the discourse seriously, so to speak. So decadence, on the other hand, reminds us of the incompleteness of science. This is what it reminds us of the incompleteness of science, At this point, another characteristic aspect of the decadence reading of philosophy of science occurs. Decadence reminds us that the concepts human beings apply in science are never complete, only valuable for the time being. And the word only I used on the slide is not pejorative here, but describes the normal course of events in handling scientific insights. This is, of course, what Thomas Kuhn called normal science, in contrast to the paradigms changing, being incommensurable to each other. So, decadence reminds us that moral, scientific, personal standards can reach a height and can fall. So the concept which has not been perceived as a concept before because of prejudice of decadence re-evaluates the view on science. This is the role of the decadence notion in my talk. So decadence shows that concepts are safe, but they are safe temporarily. So what is the point in this renewal? What is the point? Decadence heals us from a false temporal belief. This is the idea that concepts should last within a certain time frame unquestioned, as if they could last forever. Because this view of temporality in science implies that there might be an enduring insight which would never worn out, which would never go out of fashion, as if they could last forever. But this, of course, this is not so. And decadence reminds us that we actually share, in most cases, a false temporal belief. So B, decadence gets us used to the idea of contingency and uncertainty as the conditions of modern philosophizing. That is what Feierabend is all about in most parts of his work. There is a metaphor in Wittgenstein's later work on certainty. It was published posthumously by the editors, not put together by himself, published in 1969, on certainty. And there is the idea of a river floating in the riverbed. Floating in the riverbed, but the riverbed can also change its way over time. The words floating in the riverbed are safe, but temporarily so, and that is enough. This is important to understand. The words, the stream of the words in the riverbed is floating, but the riverbed itself may change its course over time, and this does no harm. The words do still have their linguistic meaning. As seasons change, some thoughts have to fall. This is what decadence reminds us of. Wittgenstein reminds us that we can be satisfied with the riverbed changing, so to speak. We don't need absolute certainty. Feierabend goes into that direction when he questions the standard of rationality as a theme in the music of time which could never change. He questioned that. So the melody will change, so to speak. If there is no common structure constituting the sciences, as Feierabend puts it in his introduction to the Chinese edition of Against Method, some thoughts have to fall. Then there is another important aspect of this context. I'll teach you differences is a quotation from Shakespeare's King Lear, and you can find it, you could find it in the philosophical investigations if Wittgenstein had used this as a motto. He didn't use it, he used something else, but he intended to use it, and this is well known to the Wittgenstein researchers, of course. I'll teach you differences from Shakespeare's King Lear, and this reminds us that differences are actually the constituting motive of linguistic meaning which comes into being. Which is really signifying something. How the question how words signify is really in Wittgenstein's view, which is the modern view of the 20th century, the end of the 20th century. The philosophical investigations were published in 1953 after his death posthumously, and the idea that differences constitute our language use and not sameness is very prominent here and has had many consequences in scientific discourse, of course. So one example is of this difference view is that the Copernican revolution, as the changes it brought about, are not the result of a one-dimensional thinking process, but the outcome of a thinking process which was able to be thoroughly differentiated. Well, I mentioned Wittgenstein. This can serve, the quotation, I'll teach you differences from Shakespeare's King Lear, can serve as a motto to Wittgenstein's idea of differences constituting linguistic meaning, so to speak. Well, then, there is kind of a positivistic prejudice which Feierabend tries to destroy, and this is, I quote, it's a quotation from Feierabend's Against method. I quote, "The fettling completeness is the first and most fundamental objection against all reconstructions that have been offered. They still depend on the positivistic prejudice that observations alone decide a case and that they can judge a theory all by themselves, without any help or hindrance from alternatives." So what he's criticizing is actually the idea that our ideas about things in the sense of observations, of our perceptions, only rule the theoretical outcome in a one-dimensional way. As he puts it, all by themselves, they seemingly could judge a theory without any help or hindrance from alternatives, but there is actually more to science, of course, than just a positivistic prejudice. So we have not only observation in scientific explanations, that is what he reminds us of, what Feierabend reminds us of, but the ideal of rational reconstruction itself is based on a set of rules that it has to preserve when entering the reconstruction process. So we can ask, with what we said just before about Francis Bacon and the idolaphoria and the doctrine of the idols, we can ask if an expression like rational reconstruction itself is not again set or based in the realm of the idol speech, in the realm of the idola, so to speak. In the narrow positivistic approach, this process is based on observation only, and that narrows the possibilities for future understanding. Of course, it is an overestimation of the faculty of perception, as if this were the only ingredient of a scientific explanation. But actually it's not the only ingredient, but there are many others, and this is also the way in which the anything goes slogan Feierabend is so notorious for and famous for, and anything goes. This has often been misunderstood because it does not mean that all kinds of theory are now really important without any difference. So as if he would like to defend relativism, it's actually not relativism, it's no ism at all, it's just the idea, and this is referring to his former teacher Popper, that there is not only a plurality of theories, as Popper said, as Popper conceded this, but there is of course a plurality of methods. And this is the main difference between Popper and the late Feierabend, the plurality of methods and not only of theories. So in the narrow positivistic approach, of course, this process is based on observation only, but as I said, it's not the only ingredient of a scientific explanation. So objectivity seems to be another word for thinking. The history of rationality is a story of acceptance and contempt. It means being despised for following the wrong path, the wrong direction of thinking, where the official doctrine is one of freedom of thought. You have this official doctrine, freedom of thought, but perhaps you already can see it, you can sense it. This freedom of thought also has, again, an idol-like quality. It's not really a freedom of thought, but it's something which is implemented in a discourse of power struggles also, and as Feierabend puts it in a later interview, of kind of group identity and not really of the pure innocent interest in scientific so-called insights. So this freedom of thought is as vague as it is a symptom. The so-called hard sciences seem to be safe from the factor of subjectivity and its destabilizing mystery. In the footsteps of Auguste Comte, J.B. Watson and Otto Neurath, objectivity became another word for thinking. And the idea is, of course, that you cannot equate the things in this way. So objectivity is actually not another word for thinking. Even more, it's the objectivity myth. The objectivity myth. To be objective meant to meet the requirements of a scientific endeavor perfectly, but the frame of this action was limited. So Feierabend reminds the scientific community of its own limitations. Of course, one should not simply replace the objectivity by the subjectivity. It's not about substitution here, but what subjectivity means in the 20th century is far from the usual Cartesian approach of the subject searching for certainty in the sense of this example I give here, ego autem sum substantia. And if you're interested in this further, I have the reference here. It's Andreas Kämmerling, Ideen des Ichs, Studien zu Descartes' Philosophie, so ideas of the I, of the self, studies in Cartesian philosophy, Frankfurt am Main 1996, so it's published 1996. The ego is a substance not needing any other entity except God to exist. This is what Descartes says. So the ego is really self-sufficient in a certain way. But decadence, on the other hand, refers to the cyclic model showing that change is inevitable. This is one of the main consequences when applying the decadence model, in the realm of science, that change is inevitable if you think of the four seasons really following each other round and round. So modern thinking, Feierabend reminds us, is not that substance bound. The modernity, the concept of decadence was neglected in this concept because one main metaphor of life is neglected in thinking, which praises only the one-dimensional standard of rationality, and the cyclic reality of our life is mostly overlooked. It's not seen anymore. So the cyclic model of life we see in nature. Seeing life as a circle with respect to natural phenomena, in this case the four seasons, shows an understanding of those phenomena where change, as I said, is inevitable. Change is inevitable. So giving up the one-dimensional view on objectivity means following the falling of the leaves in autumn or the sun at its height in midsummer. Those things alter states of affairs, but do not threaten us. They do not threaten us. The ethical point comes in. What is a subject's role in the face of change? In a paraphrase of the famous slogan, anything goes, we can say now anything goes because everything will go in the sense of the cyclic model. So everything will go, scientific concepts change, even the positivistic observation. So even this positivistic prejudice will change and is bound to change over time. But the cyclic model teaches us not to fear the change of concepts. If we don't have to fear the change of concepts, we can give up the one-dimensional view on objectivity, which is also a kind of attitude, as the only means to produce scientific results. And of course, there are certain kinds of scientific results which cannot only be produced in the way a factory produces goods or commodities. So it's very important to put objectivity as a category in a relative position, Only Feierabend reminds us that the process of thinking does not happen in a factory but in an open discourse. So you have some Marxist associations here. On the other hand, subjectivity is not threatening either. It is not the meaning-defining aspect in the use of linguistic science. And what is meant by that is Wittgenstein's fight against mentalism. You know, you don't have to really to banish the inner forever, but it's not a criterion for how linguistic meaning comes into being. You don't look in the inner, you don't look in the inner realm, you don't need the inner theater, so to speak. You don't need the inner theater. But we need two things: to put the idol of objectivity in a relative, not in an absolute position, and to be aware of the ambivalent role of subjectivity in post-Cartesian times. Subjectivity is not to fear as a myth bringing in the irrational, and some say that rationality is the highest form of the irrational or stems from the irrational, but it is not meaning-defining either, as I just said, because you don't need the inner process to define linguistic meanings when people are interacting. So the reason for this ambivalence is that after the linguistic turn in the 20th century, the general insight was stressed that language use is a public thing, it's a public affair, so to speak. The individual, his or her subjectivity, was to be seen, not denied, in favor of the blunt objectivity standard. Yeah. So decadence, on the other hand, is a wider concept. And in the end, decadence is a concept, I quote, by no means confined to literature and by no means confined to the 19th century, and this is by Thornton, The Decadent Dilemma. You have the reference on the slide. It's not confined to literature, and well, this is important really to stress, because decadence is mainly known as a concept in literature. For example, Joris Karl Huysmans or Eduard von Keyserling and others, you know, describing a world of decadence, sometimes of the dandy, or in Keyserling's case, of living in the estates of the aristocratic families at the end of a time where this aristocracy was at its height and was really the ruling class. So it is rather the more general insight into the cyclical development of social and political phenomena. So there is something political, there is something social about it. You know, philosophy of science in this case is not abstinent from the political cause. Cyclic orientation is not teleological, not goal-orientated, so to speak, but the decrease of a teleological understanding of science is also a characteristic element of modernity itself, especially in the 20th century. So if we talk about decadence as a possible element of some thinking, some thoughts in philosophy of science, we are really thinking and rethinking aspects of modernity. So I come to some conclusions of these things I just described. The building of scientific theories needs to be contrasted with the notion of plurality, so to speak, as something which is there, but was hardly recognized by those believing in the normativity of the normalistic standard. Yeah, so actually the question is if there really is kind of a normalistic standard, and this is of course questioning what Thomas Kuhn thought to be the normal science in the time when no paradigm changes occurred and the incommensurability hypothesis was not at stake, when this normal science was really pursued. So decadence is a way to value what is not at its height and has the potential to develop, so to speak. The tradition of decadence actually belongs to the political public sphere if you think of Montesquieu's Considérations sur les causes de la grandeur de l'humain et de leur décadence, 1734, and Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, 1776, but this is just to give you the references to set the standards. These references set the standard of thinking as decadence as something already over historically, and it's really important if we speak of Feierabend to see that decadence is not only a notion of history, but it has really some acuteness about it. It's really important to implement it now into the scientific discourse. Re-estimating decadence as a concept connected to crucial issues of the philosophy of science and science as a whole might seem as an act of late justice, because actually this element of decline, of decay, of the change, of the inevitable change in scientific theories was always a part of the science, and of course also of the normal sciences, when the paradigm changes were not at stake. This was always there, so to speak, but there was no justice done to it, and this is just a reminder that some categories cannot be seen or even peter out if this objectivity myth is really governing the whole way, the whole fashion of scientific research is done. So decadence applied to the philosophy of science adds to a discussion privileging simple progress the idea of ever-repeated ups and downs. And this is, of course, questioning the progress, questioning the perfectibility mode, as one might call it, questioning the perfectibility mode, because the idea, the development of science is not teleological anymore. And this is really combines with some idea in aesthetics of the 20th century, because I said the case of implementing this decadence notion in the discourse of the philosophy of science is really a thing of modernity. And well, you have to mention, of course, Charles Baudelaire, the poet, the French poet. He is one example of how modernity really affected broader cases of thinking, broader cases how human subjects, how human beings were thinking about themselves and about their own subjectivity. And Baudelaire's Fleurs du Mal, you know, as a French poet, are really one important phenomenon showing how this came about, how these changes were brought about in this time of modernity. So the intellect is not threatened by decadence, seemingly questioned scientific results. It's not threatened. It's, on the other hand, it's enriching the intellect if you really allow the scientific researcher and the philosopher to question his own results. And this is then, of course, another shade, so to speak, of the anything goes slogan. Thank you very much.